If I told you to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would likely picture a dense tropical wilderness full of amazing and exotic animals. And you'd be right, that is a good representation of the Amazon rainforest. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive city. It's called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, right along the Amazon River. And it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. All it takes in Manaus is simply walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided to make a TV show about what it was actually like to live in his hometown of Manaus. And unlike other crime shows in Brazil that often censored out the most graphic content they covered, Wallace decided he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus, and he felt like the only way to do that was to show everything. And so that year, he launched this show, which he called Canal Livre, which translates roughly to free channel. And true to form, there was no filter on what went on the air. And so this show was shocking. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims that are lying out in the road and slumped over chairs in restaurants and behind steering wheels. And the cameraman would zoom in on their fatal injuries, and they would zoom in on the faces of these people that have just died. Every gratuitous detail, every blood spatter, every grieving family member of the victim who's crying out in pain, all of it was shown on this TV show. And then, in between these very dark and violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter side. They would bring on local artists to talk about what they're working on, to maybe try to sell some of their goods. The show would also focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help raising some money, and so the show was designed to get people to donate. And then also, for really no reason at all, there was a segment on the show where this puppet character would get into a fight with a man selling bread. It was a totally bizarre and shocking spectacle, and the people of Manaus loved it. And then eventually, the people of Brazil loved it. I mean, this was an extremely popular show. Because Wallace was often on camera on Canal Livre, he became very famous and very recognizable. And so when he would walk around Manaus, people would see him and literally just start clapping and cheering for him. And as he and his show became more and more popular across South America, Wallace decided he didn't just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight crime. So, on air, Wallace began berating the government for not being able to protect its citizens, and he berated the police for not being able to catch the criminals. And then off the air, Wallace campaigned for and was elected to political office in Manaus, where he continued to push hard to reduce crime in the city. And so it wasn't long before Wallace went from just being a relatively well-known TV host to being one of the most beloved and influential and trustworthy people in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one strange thing about his show, Canal Livre, that people just couldn't wrap their heads around. This oddity was most obvious in a now famous episode of Canal Livre that aired sometime in the mid-2000s. This episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a jungle, and there's a cameraman filming them from behind. And this reporter, they're very carefully walking through, kind of pushing branches out of the way and high-stepping over all the underbrush. And then at some point up ahead, you see there is a clearing, and there is a third person standing in this clearing, and they're clearly looking straight down at something on the ground that we can't see. But this third person is very occupied with whatever is on the ground. And so eventually, this reporter makes their way through the jungle into this clearing, and then as soon as the cameraman gets into the clearing as well, he looks down at what is on the ground. And what you see is what appears to be a log that has previously been lit on fire because it's still smoking and it's black and it's charred. But as the cameraman zooms in, you see there are hands on this log. So you realize it's not a log, it's a human being who's obviously deceased. And based on how badly charred they are and how much they're still smoking, you realize very quickly that this person must have been on fire very recently as probably just a couple of minutes ago. Like right before the camera got here, this person was on fire. And so as you're kind of seeing this shocking image, the reporter suddenly talks about this person like he knows all the details of them already. He says, this person, it's a man, and they were not shot to death, they were doused with gasoline and burned alive. But at this point, the police had not come out. They had not seen this dead person yet. And so it made no sense that the reporter would have all this information on hand because no one knows this stuff yet. And based on just looking at this person's body, it was too badly burned to be able to tell whether it was a man or whether they had been shot or not or whether gasoline was used. But when Wallace was questioned about where he and his reporters got their information from, he just said, look, we're a very popular show and people call us often before they call the police and they give us information about what's happening in the city. And we have a huge team. We watch the police headquarters, we listen to the police's radio, we watch the morgue, we have loads of informants all over the city. And so we just get our information really, really quickly. And this answer was enough until 2008. That year, in October, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who just went by the name Moa, and they accused him of 9 murders. And so they throw him in jail, but Moa, despite the seriousness of the charges against him, seems totally unfazed. It was obvious he had some sort of powerful connection outside of prison, some person or some entity that he fully expected was going to, at any moment, swoop in and magically get him out of prison. But that didn't happen. Moa just continued to sit in jail, and at some point that began to sink in that he was kind of on his own, and so he began to talk. And the story he would tell would shock Brazil. Moa would admit to having killed some people, but he would tell police, look, I'm just the assassin. The person who hired me for these killings is Wallace Souza. It would turn out Wallace Souza started his show, Canal Livre, with the best of intentions. But when his show became massively popular and it in turn made him, Wallace, also massively popular and powerful, he became corrupt. And at some point after his meteoric rise, he formed this very powerful drug cartel, and then in an effort to bolster his illegal dealings and to boost his show's ratings, he decided to start contracting hitmen like Moa to start taking out rival gang members in Manaus. And he would tell the hitman how he wanted them killed and where he wanted them killed and at what time. And then after the hitman agreed to do this, he, Wallace, would go tell his camera crews exactly where to go and at what time so that they would be arriving at the murder scene literally right as it was happening or right afterwards, allowing them the opportunity to get all the gory footage before anybody else. It would take the police a year to finally compile enough evidence to charge Wallace with murder, but they would do it in October of 2009, and eventually Wallace would turn himself in. However, he denied everything. And then before he went to trial, he would die of a heart attack in prison. And so we never actually got to learn the full extent of what exactly Wallace Souza had done, how many people he had had assassinated, and how many of them were shown on his TV show. But we do know that at least 3 of his assassination victims were shown on his TV show, one of them being the person that was found out in the jungle. They really were a man. They really had not been shot. They had been burned alive with gasoline at Wallace's discretion. But in the end, the person who paid the highest price for the Canal Livre killings was Moa, the hitman who blew the whistle on what was going on with the show. On New Year's Day in 2017, a crime syndicate overran the prison where Moa was being held. Now, they had lots of targets of people they were going there to kill, and one of them was Moa. They were furious with him that he spoke to police and gave up information about the drug trade in Brazil. And so eventually, this angry mob of gangsters made their way over to Moa's cell, and when they found him, he was pressed up against the back of his cell wall, basically as far away from the bars as he possibly could be, and he began pleading for his life, and this horde was not having it. They were only there to kill him. And so they all have machetes and knives, and they're looking at him through the bars, and they say, we're going to come in there, we're going to cut you to pieces. And so then they start banging on the door, they're trying to hack the lock open, and Moa, he can't do anything. All he can do is kind of just keep himself all the way to the back of the cell and hope they don't get in. And eventually, they can't open the door, and they know it. And so they do the next best thing. They reach through the bars with a lighter and they light Moa's mattress on fire. And so Moa was trapped. He had nowhere to go, and so eventually the fire reached him and he burned alive. The next and final story of today's episode is called Inside a Nigerian Death Factory. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas, and in Ibadan, which is one of Nigeria's biggest cities, home to 3.5 million people, there are a lot of Okadas. However, despite their massive numbers, these Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. Basically, as they went about their day, driving around the city, dropping fares off, all of these Okadas would be going down side streets and looking in back alleys and checking all over the city for their missing members. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sidiku, and unlike the other 2 riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. Lanre was part of a group of Okadas within the city who all kind of met up on the same city street, and that's where they stayed throughout the course of their day, trying to wave down fares as they came up. And so everyone in that meetup point all knew each other, and so they all knew Lanre. And on the day he went missing, they recalled seeing him driving away from this meetup point with 2 passengers on the back of his bike. Now, typically, the rides these Okadas would offer to their passengers were very short. They're only driving them just around the city. And so it was very quickly noticed that Lanre had left and after several hours had still not come back yet. When it was noticed by the other Okadas, they began talking about it and someone said, give him a call, make sure he's okay. And so they called his cell phone and Lanre did not pick up, which was highly unusual, not just for Lanre, but amongst the other Okadas. They always had their phones on because they're looking for new customers and customers could be calling them. And so their cell phone is a vital part of their work. And so his phone is off, they don't really know what to make of that, and then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. However, he was calling them on his second cell phone. Lanre would keep a work phone and a personal phone, so he was calling them on his personal phone. And so when this other Okada answered the phone and heard Lanre's voice, he put the phone on speaker so the others who were concerned could hear what was going on. And what they heard was Lanre, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that he needed help. He said that he and 8 other people he was with, who he didn't even know, had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. Lanre also explained that when they had been kidnapped, the captors had taken all of their belongings, but they hadn't recognized that Lanre had this secondary cell phone, which is why he was calling from it. And so in between Lanre's frantic descriptions of what was going on and what had happened to him, these Okadas that received this call, they can hear in the background these other 8 people that are with Lanre in this underground cell screaming out as loud as they can, probably to get the attention of someone, anyone who was above ground who might be able to come down and save them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. The Soka forest was a very dense stretch of wilderness right on the outskirts of Ibadan. Lanre would tell them that he had no idea where specifically in the Soka forest he was. However, he said, if you just keep walking on that path, eventually you'll hear us calling out from underground and you can come and save us. And so as the riders turned on their bikes and they got ready to head out and go rescue their friend, they told Lanre to stay on the line. Let us keep talking to you until we find you. But as they're telling him that, his phone abruptly cuts out. And then when they tried calling him back, his phone was off. About 40 Okadas from Lanre's meetup spot took off together and sped down city streets until they hit this major highway that would take them out of the city. And then once they were out of the city, they went down this other road that brought them right towards the Soka forest. And then as this road put them right up against the tree line on their left side of the Soka forest, they all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. There's no way they can get their motorcycles onto the path, not only because the burned out cars are blocking their way, but because the path itself is so overgrown with vegetation. I mean, they can barely see the path, let alone drive something through it. And so the men leave their bikes by the side of the road, and then unarmed, they walk past the burned out cars onto this path, and then because it was so narrow, they had to walk more or less in a single file line into the Soka forest. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound, because again, they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive somewhere underground. And so they're silently marching through this forest when all of a sudden, the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city. When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realize they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. They considered calling the police, but given the lackluster response to the other two missing Okadas, they realized they probably would have a higher chance of saving their friend and the others if they just went themselves. And so the 40 Okadas rounded up another 60 from other neighboring meetup spots, and this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. And so as they're marching down this trail, kind of expecting to get shot at any point, it doesn't happen. Instead, after quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening. And right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge, this kind of crumbling old stone bridge that goes over this river. And then on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, they can see there are two dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them, and from their perspective, they're maybe 100 feet away from this shack. They can't tell if anybody's inside of this building. And then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big tall cement walls, and then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And so this huge posse of Okadas, they come storming out of the forest and they run over to that bridge, which is the one way across. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the two buildings. They're not seeing anybody. And then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. It's lying on the banks of this river, kind of tucked up underneath the bridge as if someone had stolen it. And so everyone already knows Lanre is somewhere over here. We're going to go find him. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door, and there's no one inside. But the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. And so after kind of looking this over and not really sure what to make of it, the posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And when they reach the fence, they're kind of expecting to be met with some sort of resistance. I mean, the last time they were out here, they got shot at. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose, and he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. And so as they're walking, the windows that lead into this warehouse, they're too high up, so you can't actually see what's going on inside. It's silent, there's a pretty bad smell, but they don't really know what to make of this. They walk around this structure, and when they get to the very back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. And then as soon as he did that, a few other Okadas quickly stepped through the threshold into the warehouse, preparing themselves to have to fight potentially if there are gunmen or anybody else inside that might want to do them harm. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area, to get to the warehouse. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows, and they said it would typically show up most nights of the week around 8 p.m. And they said it would just go down the road, it would make its way over to the warehouse area, and then around 9:30 p.m., they would hear or see the black Jeep leaving. Now, none of the locals knew who was driving this Jeep, although they knew it was a man. That was really all they knew. And they had no idea what this man did when he got over near the warehouse. However, for the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it, and actually told the people, don't worry about it. And so over the years, the locals had kind of just accepted that this man in his black Jeep and the screams coming from this warehouse were just a part of life. And so no one even reported it anymore. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100+ Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse, they were not met with any resistance. Anyone that had been there, any other gunmen or guards or anything like that, they had fled when they heard the sound of this massive posse whooping and yelling on their way in. And so as these Okadas are standing inside of this structure surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. And then just off of the side of the lowest point of the slab was this wooden bowl that had dark stains inside of it that was positioned in such a way that if you put water on the slab, the water would drain off of that corner directly into this bowl. Basically, it was there to catch any runoff from whatever was happening on this slab. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so human body part factories, like this warehouse in Soka Forest, were established in order to meet the high demand of people that needed these parts. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed, and he would make a list of those parts, and then at 8 p.m. he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse, and they would determine out of all the captives they had who had the parts they needed, And then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one, they would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab, known as the slaughtering slab, and they would hack off the required body parts and would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave. And then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, which cuts off people's heads, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used to discard of the people they could no longer harvest organs from. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, still inside of this warehouse, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And then after checking all of the dead bodies and body parts that were inside of the warehouse and then also right outside, where there were a number of shallow mass graves, they couldn't find Lanre amongst them either. And so this huge posse began looking all over the property for an entrance to this underground prison that Lanre had described being in. But they couldn't find it, and so eventually this posse made their way back over to the survivors who were being tended to by locals that had come over, and they asked the survivors, are you aware of any underground prison cells somewhere around here where other people were being held? But the survivors either didn't know or just were unable to speak anymore. And so later that day, when the police did come out because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell. Lanre and 8 others, and who knows how many others beyond them, are trapped underground in these cells, and we gotta get to them. But the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so the Okadas once again came together as a community and would spend the next several weeks going back out to this forest and just manually began digging up all over this entire property in hopes of finding their friend and the rest of these people that were trapped underground. But they never did. And so we don't know what happened to Lanre and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. We don't know what happened to the other 2 Okada riders who went missing right before Lanre did, although it's generally assumed they most likely were kidnapped as well and probably met a similar fate. We also have no idea how many people were butchered inside of the Soka Forest warehouse. However, given the massive amount of clothing and shoes inside of that black shack, it's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka Forest. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lanre, when they discovered there was this man who was there who was kind of walking around acting suspicious, and so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police, she had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were stripping their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint, and then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed. Margaret Douglas loved sitting out on the front porch of her neat gray house in Wadsworth, Ohio. Settled comfortably into one of the white wicker chairs that overlooked her 6-foot-high rhododendron bushes with their clusters of purple flowers, she knew all of her neighbors by name. And she also knew by heart the daily rhythms of this quiet street in a town of fewer than 2,400 residents. Wadsworth was one of those tiny middle American towns that you could find pictured on a postcard. And since Margaret and her husband had arrived in this town back in 1959, not much had changed. Now, in the early spring of 2018, Margaret was 98 years old, and the chilly April air was still keeping her inside. But even though Margaret lived alone these days, she had plenty of wonderful memories to keep her company, along with regular visits from a few close relatives and from a few of the neighbors who had become her good friends. Margaret had been born in 1919, just 1 year after World War I had come to a bloody close. By the time Margaret was just 25 years old, she had already lived through Prohibition, which was a 13-year-long ban on the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol in the United States, and she'd also lived through the Roaring Twenties and the Age of Jazz, which was a period in the 1920s and the 1930s. On December 6, 1941, Margaret and her family had listened in shock to the first news reports about the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor that catapulted the United States into World War II. And it was after World War II ended in 1945 that Margaret, at the age of 39, met and married her husband, Donald Douglas, a World War II U.S. Army veteran. For her whole life, Margaret had been a person who held firm opinions and wasn't afraid to share them with the world. And in her husband, Donald, Margaret had found the perfect match. Once they were married and settled into their 3-bedroom house in Wadsworth, together they bucked convention. Instead of having children, they centered their lives around each other, on travel, and on their careers. Margaret loved her job in nearby Akron, Ohio, where she worked at O'Neill's, which was one of the biggest and most glamorous department stores in the state. As for Donald, he proudly told people he worked at the Ohio Match Company, the world's largest producer of wooden and paper matches. And during the 41 years that the couple was married, they would live through the ups and downs of history together. The Civil Rights Movement, the first moonwalk, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the hippie movement of the 1960s, the age of rock and roll, and the Gulf War in 1991. When Donald passed away in May of 2000 at the age of 80, Margaret, who would turn 81 that year, chose to carry on living the kind of life that she and Donald had enjoyed as a couple. Her first decision was to remain right where she was, living in the house at 359 Portage Street in Wadsworth that held so many happy memories for her and her late husband. She might not have Donald by her side anymore, but, as her nephew Howard Leisure and his wife Cindy knew, Margaret had never been a quitter, and she'd always had this wonderful appetite for life. Over the next couple of decades, Margaret, who was now a widow, spent most of her time socializing with friends or gardening or reading books or watching TV, and she also spent a lot of time watching from her front porch one procession after another of neighborhood kids growing from toddlers to teenagers. Even in 2018, when Margaret was 98 years old, she still kept busy and enjoyed good health. Despite spending more and more time inside of her home, she still cared very much about her physical appearance, she kept up with the news, and she still very much looked forward to her regularly scheduled appointments with her hairdresser. Margaret's philosophy on life was simple. The world changed, and so she needed to change right along with it. On the morning of Thursday, April 5th of 2018, Margaret woke up and made her way to the front door to collect her newspaper. When she opened the door, she saw gray clouds in the sky and felt the chilly spring air blow across her face. She could already tell she would not be spending any time outdoors that day. Her body just could not handle the cold anymore. So, after getting dressed and eating her breakfast, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair in the living room and read a book and also watched some TV. She made 2 more light meals for herself that day, taking her time after each one to wash and dry her dishes, and she also set aside a few bills and notices that she knew she would need to get to in the next couple of days. As it grew dark outside, Margaret climbed the steps to the second floor of her house and got herself ready for bed. After washing up and putting on her nightdress, she went back down the stairs and curled up on the couch to read a bit more of her book and catch a little more TV before going to sleep. A little while later, as snowflakes fell outside of her window, Margaret decided that she was so cozy right there in her warm living room that she would just sleep down there on her couch that night. After turning off the TV and setting her book on the table nearby, Margaret snuggled down into her pillow and closed her eyes. Before she actually fell asleep, it hadn't even crossed her mind to get up and go make sure the front and back doors of her house were locked. She had lived in that house for more than 70 years and had stopped locking the doors a long time ago. 3 days later, at 9 a.m. on Monday, April 9th, the Wadsworth Police Department got a call from Margaret's nephew, Howard Leisure, who lived in a town just outside of Wadsworth about 40 minutes away. Howard told police that the day before, one of Margaret's neighbors had noticed newspapers were piling up against her front door, and when he, Howard, had tried calling her, she had not picked up, and considering her age, he was concerned about her. So, police immediately sent a patrol officer to 359 Portage Street for a welfare check. When officers arrived at Margaret's house, they found the front door was unlocked, so they stepped inside the residence and called out for Margaret, but the house was silent. They began searching the property, but there was no sign of a disturbance, nor was there any sign of Margaret, except that her walker, which she took everywhere with her, was still neatly tucked behind a well-used armchair in the living room. Finally, after searching the whole house and finding nothing, the police called back to their station and filed a missing person report. Then, the police who had done the search contacted Howard and his wife to inform them of the situation and to ask them to come to Wadsworth to assist in the search for Margaret. While police waited for Howard and Cindy to arrive at the house, they spoke with some neighbors who had gathered outside, and they would tell the police that the last time they had actually physically seen Margaret was a few days earlier on Thursday, April 5th. By late afternoon, Howard and Cindy had arrived at Margaret's house, and after speaking with police, they quickly walked up the front stairs and into Margaret's home. Inside, the first thing that Howard noticed was that the small red wallet that his aunt always carried with her or left on the little table next to her favorite armchair was missing. And a few minutes later, Howard opened the small downstairs closet, thinking maybe Margaret had left the wallet inside of a coat pocket that was hung up inside of that closet. But instead of finding Margaret's clothes hung neatly on hangers like they would normally be, the closet was a jumble of clothes piled on top of his aunt's vacuum cleaner on the ground. Peeking out from the bottom of the pile, Howard spotted one of the slippers his aunt often wore. Stooping down, Howard reached out and he grabbed it. Seconds later, the police and Cindy would hear Howard let out a scream of pure horror. They ran from the living room and found Howard on the ground, recoiling in shock and pointing at the open closet in front of him. Within minutes, there were dozens of police and emergency vehicles outside of 359 Portage Street. As neighbors looked out their windows to see what was happening on an otherwise cold and quiet Monday evening, a patrol officer was already blocking off the perimeter of Margaret's property with bright yellow crime scene tape. Inside, other officers wearing gloves and crime scene gear were gathered around the open door of that tiny downstairs closet, while Howard sat in another room, his wife's arm wrapped around his shaking shoulders while she tried to comfort him. When Howard had tugged on his aunt's slipper, he had felt a foot still inside of it. Moments later, police would discover Margaret's body, all but naked, crammed inside of this little closet underneath the pile of clothes. Her head, face down, was wedged into the back corner of the closet, while her backside was up in the air, her knees bent underneath her at a sharp angle. Margaret was deceased, and based on the condition of her body, it was obvious she had been the victim of a violent homicide. Within hours of discovering Margaret's body, investigators were combing Margaret's property looking for clues, and it wasn't long before they found their first important piece of physical evidence. It was a single food service-type plastic glove with small traces of blood on it, and it looked like someone had recently dropped it in Margaret's backyard. But other than this glove, which was quickly sent off for testing, The police did not find anything else on the property that could help explain what had happened to Margaret or who was responsible for the attack. While patrol officers spread out around Margaret's neighborhood to talk with residents about any unusual activity or people in the area, detectives began considering possible motives for the crime. At first, it seemed like this had been a robbery because Margaret's red wallet was missing, but it would turn out that wallet was the only thing missing from Margaret's house, and it only contained a little bit of cash and some credit cards that had not even been used since Margaret was last spotted on Thursday, April 5th. So with robbery more or less ruled out, police began to wonder if, Margaret had enemies that might want her dead. But everyone the police spoke with said the same thing. Margaret got along with everyone. No one would want to hurt her. And so, with no obvious motive or suspect, the police simply began investigating everyone who was close to Margaret. They started with Howard and Cindy, but they were both quickly ruled out using their cell phone data. Police would also speak to other family members and friends, and they too would all be quickly ruled out as well. But when they started interviewing neighbors and former neighbors, one person stood out. His name was David Klinkenbach, and even after moving from the house next to Margaret's to a new address 2 miles away, David had continued to be the person who checked up on Margaret most frequently. He'd stop by her house a couple of times a week, and he helped take care of her weekly trash collection, moving her garbage containers to and from the street on trash day. Right after Margaret's body had been discovered, police had actually called David's home because they had been told he was close with her and so they wanted to speak to him, but he had not answered. Instead, police found him right outside of her house, pacing around chain-smoking cigarettes and telling anyone who would listen that he was very nervous about his fingerprints being all over the inside of Margaret's home. When police spoke to him, he obsessively asked them how was the investigation going so far and what had they discovered inside of the house. So, feeling very suspicious of David, the police would bring him into the station for questioning, and pretty much right away, David began looking more and more suspicious. David seemed to have information about details of Margaret's death that had not been widely shared, like where exactly in her house she had been found and what she was wearing, and when answering police questions about how well he knew Margaret, David also surprised investigators with random comments on Margaret's appearance and the fact that, especially earlier in her life, she had been a very attractive woman. But by the end of Wednesday, April 11th, so 2 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, David would be ruled out as a suspect. The DNA results from the bloody glove that had been found in Margaret's backyard had come back, and the blood on them did not belong to David, nor did it belong to anyone the police had spoken with thus far. Additionally, Margaret's autopsy had come back, and her time of death was listed as sometime around Friday, April 6th, and the data from David's cell phone showed he was not near her property at that time. So now, with the residents of Wadsworth starting to press law enforcement for answers, police were forced to regroup and take a different approach to finding out who, in this quiet, pretty town, would have wanted to kill a seemingly harmless 98-year-old woman. The only thing that seemed even remotely promising as another possible lead were reports from neighbors that in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, there had been a rash of minor car break-ins. Nothing very serious, just a few car owners who had told police that their unlocked vehicles had been rifled through and small items like change and dollar bills had been taken. But these crimes of opportunity made police wonder if the perpetrator had started to check for unlocked homes as well as unlocked cars. Maybe they had tried Margaret's front door, they had found it open, and before long, what started as a robbery turned into a murder. And when police started looking right around Margaret's house to see if around the time she was killed, had there been any car break-ins or had there been any other recent reports of suspicious or possibly criminal activity, they found something. A carjacking had been reported right near Margaret's house on April 8th, so this would have been 1 day before Margaret's body was found. So the police tracked down the person who owned the vehicle that had been stolen. The owner was a 50-year-old church worker named Paul Shalit. Police expected this interview to be fairly simple and straightforward, but it wasn't. When police visited Paul at his house and asked him to describe what happened, he came across as very nervous and evasive. He told investigators that he had been out driving and had seen a young man, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and he apparently was limping as he was walking down the sidewalk. And so Paul, being a good Samaritan, had slowed down and asked this young man if he needed help, and the young man had said yes, he did need help. So Paul said he had pulled his SUV over to the side of the curb and he had got out to help the injured young man. But as soon as Paul had climbed out of his vehicle and had begun walking around the back of the vehicle to make his way over to the sidewalk, apparently this young man had lunged and opened the passenger side door of Paul's SUV. He had leapt across the middle console into the driver's seat and then had sped off, leaving Paul stranded. However, this story didn't really make sense to police because, according to the report, Paul's car had been found almost immediately and right down the street, totally undamaged. And after police wrapped up this first interview with Paul, they would review security footage of the carjacking that had been captured by cameras on a nearby building, and they saw firsthand that Paul's story was just not lining up. The footage of the carjacking showed that there was this young man on the sidewalk near where Paul's car slowed and stopped, but the young man was not limping, and as soon as Paul had stopped his car next to the curb, he didn't get out of the vehicle. Instead, the young man approached the passenger side of the vehicle and appeared to be speaking into the window, presumably to Paul, and then after a couple of minutes, the young man climbed into the vehicle with Paul. And then a few minutes later, Paul would suddenly jump out of the car, and the car, with the young man still inside of it, would take off down the road. So the police went back to Paul's house to question him again, and when confronted with the security footage of the carjacking, Paul would eventually tell police the truth. It would turn out the carjacking actually started as an encounter that Paul had set up using the social networking site Grindr that caters to people who identify as gay, bi, trans, and queer. According to Paul, he and the young man had met as planned and had begun a sexual encounter inside of Paul's SUV. But then, according to Paul, the young man, quote, snapped. And then a few moments later, the young man had overpowered Paul, forcing him out of the car onto the road, and then the young man sped off, leaving Paul standing there in the middle of the street. And then when the car was recovered later that day down the road, the young man was not found. When asked by detectives to provide contact information for this young man/carjacker, Paul would tell them that he was so embarrassed about what had happened that he had actually deleted all remnants of this young man from his phone, meaning he had completely deleted his Grindr account and so could not recover it, and he also had deleted the contact information for this young man that he had stored directly on his phone. So with no way of finding or identifying this carjacker, the police were forced to just wait and hope this mystery carjacker eventually turned up. A few days later, on Friday, April 13th, roughly 1 week after Margaret was killed, the Wadsworth police got a call from a local construction site reporting that someone had broken into one of their trailers. When investigators arrived at the scene of the break-in, the first thing they did was search the area. And behind the trailer that had been broken into was a cell phone lying in the dirt. The police would quickly unlock the phone and discover that its owner was a teenage boy whose name was already very familiar to Wadsworth police, Zach Thronson. Zach was a troubled young man who had previously gotten in trouble for petty theft as well as breaking into people's cars. And so naturally, the police thought Zach not only must have robbed this construction site, but almost certainly had to be the mystery carjacker they were looking for. And if that was true, maybe Zach had something to do with Margaret's murder. When police tracked Zach down, they found him asleep in his car in the parking lot at a local high school, and when they looked in the driver's window at him, police immediately noticed that his knees were all cut up, and these cuts looked recent. Waking up to see police tapping on his car window, Zach was nervous as well as startled, but he quickly agreed to come into the police station to answer a few questions. Initially, Zach denied that he had anything to do with the break-in at the construction site, but once police showed him his cell phone and they told him where they had found it, Zach's shoulders slumped and his head fell forward as he gripped his knees, and he took a deep breath as he stared at the floor, and then when he looked up again at the detectives, Zach sighed and said, "Okay, yes, I was at the construction site last night." But when investigators asked him if he had also committed the carjacking 5 days earlier, Zach seemed to perk up and said, "No, I really have no idea about that. I definitely did not steal anyone's car. And when police dug into this and really put him on the spot about it because they didn't really believe him, Zach stuck to his story and said, look, I've committed other robberies, but not this one. The police eventually believed him and just asked him point blank, okay, well, did you have anything to do with Margaret's murder? And at this, Zach became extremely emphatic that of course he had heard about the murder, everyone had, but no way. He had nothing to do with that. By this point, Zach was totally rattled by the seriousness of the questions he was being asked. And so, likely just as a way of making himself seem a little bit less guilty and less suspicious, Zach started to throw his 17-year-old friend, Gavin Ramsey, under the bus. Zach said that Gavin had not only participated in every crime that Zach had, including the construction site break-in the night before, but also Gavin was the mastermind behind all of the crimes. And so if the police were thinking a local criminal had anything to do with the murder, well, they shouldn't talk to Zach, they should talk to Gavin. And the police would do just that. And when Gavin came to the police station, he did not arrive alone. Sitting next to him in the interrogation room was his mother, Christine. Gavin was the second oldest of her 4 sons, and she knew he was a troublemaker. Over the last 10 years, she had on several occasions enrolled her son in counseling, but she wasn't really sure if it was having an effect. It wasn't long into Gavin's interview before Gavin, like Zach, admitted that he had done some small stuff. He'd taken a little money from some cars recently, and he'd probably been the subject of a few noise complaints from neighbors, but that was it. When he was told that his friend Zach had placed him at the scene of the much more serious crime of breaking into the trailer at the construction site, Gavin hung his head momentarily, but then looked up and said, okay, yes, I was involved in that incident too. But when investigators asked Gavin if he had been involved in the carjacking on April 8th, Gavin's demeanor completely changed. He'd seemed almost comfortable talking about the petty theft and even the construction site break-in. But at the mention of this carjacking, he suddenly began shifting in his chair and he leaned forward and he put his face in his hands. Gavin wasn't the only person in the room to have a strong reaction. After hearing about this carjacking, Gavin's mom looked at her son and said, "Carjacking? Really?" But once detectives began describing some of the details of the carjacking, how it had started with a sexual encounter between the carjacker and the victim, Paul, Christine suddenly became far less worried that her son had potentially committed a carjacking and now was just worried that he had been potentially sexually assaulted during the carjacking. It was at this point, when his mother was really starting to get upset, that Gavin actually asked one of the investigators if he could just speak to them alone for a few minutes. And so, reluctantly, his mother and a patrol officer who had been in the room as well would leave the room, and then once Gavin was alone with the detectives, he would admit that, yes, he was the mystery carjacker. However, he wanted to correct a detail about that story, and he didn't want his mother to hear it. He told the detectives that he had agreed to meet Paul that night, but Gavin was not there to have sex with him. Instead, he had created a fake profile on Grindr to lure a gay man into meeting him so that he could rob them, and Paul was just the guy who had agreed to meet up. As far as Gavin was concerned, any man agreeing to meet a young man like him deserved whatever they got. When police felt satisfied that they had all the information they could get about the carjacking, they asked Gavin point blank if he had anything to do with Margaret's murder. And Gavin was just as adamant as his friend Zach that of course he knew about the murder. Everybody did, but he had nothing to do with it. The carjacking was his worst crime. Eventually, the detectives felt like they had gotten all the information they could from Gavin, and so they called his mother back into the room so they could release him. When she came back inside, the police told her that she and her son were free to leave for now, but before they left, the police would like to have a look at Gavin's cell phone. There was some information on there that could confirm some of the things he had told them, and so could she, his guardian, sign a consent form allowing them to do that. Gavin did not like this idea, but his mother did. She signed the form, and then moments later, the police had Gavin's phone, and the teenager and his mother were walking out of the station. A few hours later, the police would unlock Gavin's phone, and they would somewhat unintentionally discover something that shocked them to their core. Based on what they found on Gavin's phone and on evidence that police would uncover over the next 72 hours following their conversation with Gavin, Here is a reconstruction of what happened to 98-year-old Margaret Douglas on the day she died, April 6, 2018. At about 2 a.m. in the early morning hours of Friday, April 6th, Margaret's murderer walked the short distance from his house to her house. The temperature outside had dropped to about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing lightly. Margaret's street was a quiet one, each house separated from the curb by a wide strip of grass and a sidewalk, each house separated from its neighbor by a driveway leading to a detached garage. As the murderer reached the edge of Margaret's property, he looked in all directions to make sure no one was watching him, and then he quickly slipped down her driveway around to her backyard. Once there, he stepped up to the back door and peered through the glass. Inside, he could just make out the gleam of the metal sink set into the counter on the kitchen wall opposite him. Then he quietly turned the knob with a gloved hand. As he had hoped, the door was open, and a moment later, the intruder had stepped inside, out of the falling snow and the chilly air. After pausing for a minute to let his hands warm up and to look around and get his bearings, the intruder pulled his cell phone out of his pocket. He tapped the screen and entered his password, then he opened his camera and began taking a video. With his phone out in front of him recording, he began walking noiselessly through the kitchen toward the dining room. As he walked, the camera picked up how dimly lit the house was, with the only lights being from a few night lights and from street lights shining in through uncurtained windows. With the camera still rolling, he walked through the dining room and into the cozy living room in the front of the house. And there, fast asleep on her favorite sofa, was Margaret. She was dressed in slippers, a nightgown, and robe, her white hair arranged in short, neat curls around her face. The intruder stood there quietly for a few minutes, just drinking in the sight of her through the lens of his camera. Then, moving soundlessly around the blue-carpeted room, he began taking a series of videos of Margaret from different angles and different vantage points, listening all the while to her gentle, steady breathing. He felt a rush of excitement as he imagined the moment when he would wake her up and she would see him standing there in her house in the dark for the first time. With that thought in mind, now standing off to the side behind a nearby armchair, the intruder made his first deliberate noise. A cough. He heard the rustle of fabric, and then, through the camera viewfinder of his phone, he saw Margaret wake up. Staring ahead out into the darkness of her familiar living room, Margaret seemed instantly aware that suddenly she was not alone. The camera picked up her scratchy whisper. "Is someone there?" As she turned her head in his direction, the intruder stepped out of his hiding place. As he did, his camera caught an image of Margaret's face, the look of shock and fear as she realized that she'd been right, that she wasn't alone, that someone was in the room with her. But before Margaret could raise herself from the couch, the intruder stepped closer to her. He wished there was some way to capture what he was about to do to her on camera, but for what he was about to do, he knew he needed two hands. And so he turned off his camera, he slipped his phone into his pocket, and then with both of his hands, he reached down and he grabbed Margaret and he pulled her off the couch and dumped her on the ground on her back. And then he stepped on top of her and then crouched down, straddling her chest, and then he reached down and he put two hands around her neck and he began to squeeze. He knew there were many other ways to kill someone, but he didn't want to use a weapon that would put distance between him and his victim. He wanted to be there up close when they died. He wanted to feel them when they died. And so with his hands wrapped around her neck, he began squeezing harder and harder and harder, and as he did, Margaret began to fight back. Even at 98 years old, Margaret was still strong and sturdy, her hands reaching up to pull his fingers away as she rolled from side to side, trying to get out from under her attacker. But he was just too strong, and he kept squeezing harder and harder. As soon as Margaret started to go limp from a lack of oxygen, the killer released her neck. Barely alive and barely breathing, Margaret had no strength left to try to get away, so she just laid there on her back, still. As she did, her killer, who was still straddling her chest, looked down at her with immense pleasure. Then he balled each of his gloved hands into fists and began punching her face over and over and over again. It was only after it was obvious that Margaret was already dead that her murderer finally leaned back and let his arms drop to his sides while he tried to catch his breath. Once his heart rate had slowed, Margaret's killer got back up onto his feet and then he dug his phone back out of his pocket. He removed most of Margaret's clothing and arranged her in various suggestive poses, taking more pictures and videos as he went, and finally taking a video of himself sexually abusing her corpse. It was almost 4 a.m. when the murderer finally noticed the time. He He had been in Margaret's house now for 2 hours, and he needed to be back at his own house before 5 a.m. But before he could leave, he needed to hide all the evidence that he had been there, and that meant hiding Margaret's body. Looking around the room, he spotted a small closet just to the right of the front door. Dragging her body across the room, he opened the closet door, and pushing and shoving, he finally managed to cram her body into the tiny space. After covering her with clothes and the vacuum cleaner, the murderer shut the door on her. Before leaving, the killer looked around the house one more time and noticed Margaret's bright red wallet sitting on an end table. Moving quickly now, he stepped over to the table, he pocketed the wallet, and then he headed for the back door of the house. Once outside again, the killer pulled off his blood-smeared plastic gloves and stuffed them inside of his jacket pockets. Just a few minutes later, the murderer was slipping quietly back into his own bedroom, just 5 houses away. What he didn't realize is that one of his bloody gloves that he had stuffed into his pockets had actually fallen out and was now laying in Margaret's backyard. 1 week later, on Friday, April 13th, after Gavin and his mother had left the police station, Wadsworth police would unlock Gavin's cell phone, and as they began looking through it, they found a folder labeled Dark. And in this folder were all the horrific videos and pictures taken of Margaret and her home on the night she was killed. The person who took those pictures and those videos, and who killed Margaret, was 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey. 3 days later, on April 16th, Wadsworth police arrested Gavin and charged him with the murder. Inside Gavin's bedroom, investigators would find the other plastic glove that matched the one dropped at the crime scene, and forensic tests on both gloves would show that the DNA and bodily fluids on the gloves matched Gavin's. Police also found Margaret's red wallet, along with notebooks belonging to Gavin that detailed his desire to kill, along with his detailed handwritten research into the crimes and methods of famous serial killers. Digging into Gavin's personal history, investigators also discovered that in the year preceding Margaret's murder, Gavin had applied for work at a local funeral home. This fact would be significant in light of a later court-ordered psychiatric report that showed that Gavin found sex with corpses exciting. Police theorized that Gavin, who had once gone to Margaret's house to ask if he could help her out with some yard work, which she didn't hire him for, chose Margaret as his victim because of her advanced age and lack of home security. In November 2018, 7 months after Margaret's murder, Ohio state prosecutors won a legal ruling that would allow the videos and images from Gavin's cell phone to be used as evidence against him in a public trial where Gavin would be charged as an adult. In response to this ruling, Gavin avoided a public trial by pleading no contest to 9 charges that included aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. Although Gavin's mother, Christine, told the judge at a sentencing hearing on January 4, 2019, that Gavin's aggressive behavior and poor judgment were caused by his pediatrician misprescribing the antidepressant Zoloft that Gavin was taking at the time of the murder, the judge ultimately sentenced Gavin to life in prison at Grafton Correctional Institution, an adult facility located 40 minutes to the northwest of Wadsworth. On Monday, April 16th, the same day that Gavin was arrested and charged with the murder, 98-year-old Margaret Douglas was laid to rest right beside her husband Donald on a quiet grassy slope in the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. On her headstone, it just reads, "In God's hands, in our hearts."
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.